It was 3:17 when something began to rasp at the tower. The sound came from below the rim of glass, from the trees where the canopy stitched itself into a seam of black. It wasn't a single noise. It was a layered thing, an undercurrent of something that sounded like dry fingers through dead leaves, a breath that wasn't human, and something else that tried to fit a human voice into the timber of a branch. I sat up, a sleeping bag hoodie against my ears, watch face cold under my palm. The lamp over the desk threw everything into a flat, functional orange. My radio hummed on the corner, a faithful low noise. But the tower had a dozen ways to tell you it was awake. The hiss of propane, the click of the sensor board, the old kettle's distant tinkle on the stove. This was different, wet and too sweet, like flowers gone wrong. On the wall above the desk, the rules were nailed to a thin plywood board. They had been here before me. Someone had written them and underlined them, and later someone else had written corrections over the original lines. The topmost line was smudged and darker than the rest. People up here joke a lot to keep from being frightened. We trade ghost stories and wrong-footed logs. The joke was always the same: rules you could follow with your thumbs, nonsense to keep your hands busy. That night, the rules read like a ledger of fear. Rules: Bryce Peterson. 1. Log everything. 2. Keep the light on. Do not follow the lights. 3. If something says your name, do not answer. 4. Do not leave the tower for any reason, unless the ranger dispatch authorizes it. 5. If blood appears, mark the time and signal for help. Do not touch the writing. I had reread them a dozen times since I arrived that summer, the black ink smeared in places, a faint scent of iron that had never quite left the paper. Bryce Peterson had written these. His name was everywhere in our little history: his posters, his scratched initials on the bunk, the tattered photo taped to the inside of the cupboard, showing him with his hat cocked and a grin that suggested he believed nothing bad could happen to a person who kept a good coffee stash. Some things, though, do. The rasping shaped into a syllable, my name, or a close imitation: Hun. I told myself it was wind making weird shapes against the glass. I told myself I had to get up, check the sensors, reset the motion cams, send a log. That's what the rules demanded: log everything. I swing my feet to the cold floor, boots thumping. The smell hit me full as I reached the bottom step. Rot. And underneath it, something floral and slick, like an overripe bouquet left too long in an office lobby. My stomach tightened. The hum I could feel behind my teeth, a low vibration that the tower electronics did not make. Short breaths, quick hands. The tower's external cameras pinged to life when I thumbed the control pad. The monitor showed trees in moon-silver black. Infrared painted them pale. Nothing but the static rhythm of branches. My sensor array had been new. Ranger station supplied, installed by Terry the month I came on. The screen split to a thermal inset. A heat blotch moved along the forest floor, low and slow, too long to be a human stride. It paused inside a sapling cluster, and then the image wavered. The motion tracker showed a spike at 0312. I typed the log with the right hand, trying to keep my fingers steady enough to form words that could stand as proof if the wrong people ever asked. 0312. Motion spike NW. Infrared blur. Sound, scratching, voice-like. Phonation approximating syllables. Smell, rot/flowers. Action, check perimeter cams. Power cycling sensors. Await further. The automated system answered within 42 seconds, a little bureaucratic voice that had the charm of a hospital paging service. An email arrived, subject line terse and immediate. From ops.automate@projectfrequency.con. Automated. Subject: Sensor spike, Tower 17, 0312. Priority: investigate. Detected electromagnetic anomaly coincident with motion spike. Recommend do not approach. Maintain elevated lighting. Initiate recording. Notify field contact. Note: Persistent vocalization patterns may indicate caller mimicry. Follow Rule 3, Bryce P. Log acknowledgement. I hadn't known ops.automate would use terminology like caller mimicry until I read through archived messages. The program had been trained on wildlife calls and human voice samples, then tuned to flag the anomalies that didn't seem to match either category. It was efficient and maddening. It was also right. Emails from automations had become one of the ways Project Frequency came into our day-to-day language. Terse, sometimes smugly precise. They could be helpful, and they could escalate things faster than a person with a conscience. I thumbed the acknowledgement key as the message politely ordered. The tower's exterior floodlights are not bright by daylight standards, but against a cohort of trees at that hour, they form a mode of white. The automated system sometimes overestimated their deterrent value. People and things like light, or they were drawn to it. The rule, keep the light on, felt less like instruction and more like superstition. Still, light was something you could control, and control is half the medicine up here. I ran the perimeter feeds. Nothing showed on regular video that the infrared didn't show, but at the very edge of one frame, where branches cluttered together, a thin vertical silhouette moved. Antler-like protrusions arced from its head. I blinked until the image filled with snow of static, then cleared, and the thing was gone. I called Terry. He answered on the second ring. "Price?" he said. His voice was always clipped, like a rivet. "You awake?" "Yeah," I said, trying to keep it flat. Motion spike, infrared blob, smell of rot. It said my name. A pause. "Stay put," he said. "Don't let it get in your head."
Log it. Keep lights on, and for God's sake, keep a radio on 1.5 and 4. Stay off the roof unless it's daylight. You coming up? I can, but I'm 20 minutes away if everything cooperates. You saw the shape? A silhouette, antlered, short step patterns, doesn't register like a deer. Then don't play hero. We don't know what it's doing. Remember what happened to Bryce. Bryce Peterson's ghost was a slow drum in every conversation among the ranger circuit. He had been one of the last to go before Project Frequency started its rotations, if go is the right word. The official log said he died in the field, a matter complicated and then folded into a classified file. The local rumors were sharper and less discreet. He had followed lights into a clearing. He'd named the rules and underlined them in ways that made them feel less like advisories and more like a covenant. His name on that plywood made people's hearts skip for reasons that weren't rational. I tightened the straps on the pistol at my hip. It was a ranger's sidearm, more for small animals and a last resort human threat. We didn't bring heavy ordnance to a fire tower. The law frowned on it, and most of us were not soldiers. But after months reading the logs and listening to the weekend's after-hour radio chatter, I'd started sleeping with more equipment than a volunteer should. The tower's automatic lights made a pool of illumination in the clearing. In that pool, the air looked thicker, like heat haze, and along the outer dark, a pair of lights blinked, not random animal eyes, but high-contrast pulses, arranged and impatient. They pulsed slowly at first, then in small bursts, almost like someone was trying to get attention. When the pulses quickened, the hairs on my neck rose. The antler silhouette stepped between two trunks, and the pulses settled onto it like moths to a porch. I recorded everything. It is easy to tell the difference between being careful and being compulsive when your life depends on a log being defensible. The rules said to log everything. I promised myself I was doing it to keep the truth intact, not just because the rules told me to. At 0328, the automated monitor sent another note. The subject line was short, almost clinical. From ops.automate@project-frequency.con, automated. Subject, EM field variance, Tower 17, 0328, action required. Variance exceeds baseline by 0.8 dB. Recommendation, deploy manual sensor sweep. If variance grows greater than 1.2 dB, engage suppression protocol. Reminder, suppression protocol uses non-lethal pulse to disrupt external target, but is single use per tower. Confirm authorization with field contact, T. Santiago, or classified override, J. Mercer. I read it twice. The suppression protocol, the one-time pulse generator the project team had installed the week before, wasn't a rumor.
It was hardware bolted to the tower's base, wrapped in a plexi case marked with a placard, Project Frequency, Pulse Suppression Unit, Single Activation. The paperwork that came with it had been inscrutable legal phrasing and 2 signatures halfway down in a column labeled Emergency Authorization. Janet, full name Janet Mercer, had signed the initial documents. She was the sort of bureaucrat who kept tenderness in a drawer and never took it out for public consumption. She could be merciful in private, by all accounts, but in the public papers she showed steel. I texted a short line to Janet's secure office number through the tower's encrypted link. Need authorization to arm pulse. EM variance increasing. There was no reply. The tower's link often lagged on late-night policy. I told myself she was asleep, or with the board, or wrestling with memos in town. Or worse, she had seen what the spike did to other sites and had chosen silence to preserve a larger plan. I did not know which terrified me more. By dawn, the cleaning of facts into daylight only sharpened the edges. The smell remained like a bruise. The periphery cams had caught something else. Closer now, a low shrouded cluster of forms moving in non-linear arcs, almost as though they were rehearsing for an audience. Movement like that can't be mistaken for deer. The antlers were not antlers in the sense of deer biology. Taller, too thin, branching with more symmetry and starting at strange angles. They cast crooked shadows that made the trees look like something else. Daylight made them less efficient at the mimicry. The voices inside the leaves thinned into clicks and then into nothing. But the minute the sun slid again, the pulses returned. People on the ground stopped believing the things they can't see. In the towers, we were paid to notice patterns. The ranger station in town sits half a day's drive down a ridge and a long phone call away. Janet's office was a place of forms and curt sealed envelopes. When I finally got through, she did not answer with a clerk's shrug. Her voice carried the tiredness of someone who'd been doing triage for years. "Hunter," she said, "we saw your log. You shouldn't have triggered the suppression memo without confirmation." "I didn't. The computer recommended it." I could hear the way the line picked up the track of my breath. "Variance is climbing, the pulses." "Listen to me," she said. "Bryce wrote the rules because he survived something. We did not record then and added to the excuse. He wrote them because he couldn't talk to me without sounding like a man with a confession. The suppression unit is a tool and a scar. We don't sign off on it lightly." "Then what's the alternative? Wait until—" "Wait until you can either verify a target or secure help. The pulse is single use. Once activated, it burns the coil and leaves you with a listening machine, not a weapon. If we fry it on a false positive, we've destroyed our only non-lethal option." "Janet, it's saying my name." "What did it sound like?" "It sounded like—" My throat closed. It wasn't a voice exactly. It was like a voice trying on a face. It had my cadence. "Then log it. Keep lights, don't go outside, and, Hunter," her voice went softer, like a tape someone turned down, "if something writes on your tower, photograph it before you touch it." When she said writes, I thought of blood and the rule about not touching. I couldn't ask her if she meant what I thought. There was another silence, the one on the other side of people trying to decide how much to tell a volunteer who might panic, and how much to tell someone who might be all that stood between containment and curiosity. Janet's calls were the middle ground of the whole operation. She told me what the project would confirm publicly and what it would hide in vaults. Her words kept the narrative shape of Project Frequency, an initiative to understand how low-level electromagnetic anomalies coincided with unexplained animal behavior, then to leverage that knowledge to monitor and protect wide tracts of wilderness, officially anyway. The less official language slid in and out of emails. Containment studies, adaptive attractant suppression, incident vectors. People were predisposed to believe a government bureaucracy would turn details into scrubbed documents. They were less inclined to imagine that someone had built a machine that taught itself to sing. I had been a volunteer ranger for 4 summers. Before this, my day-to-day was stacks of logs, wildfire reports, and watching campers forget to pack out their trash. The tower was meant to be a lookout, a quiet job for loners. Project Frequency had come as a contract through the county, classified support for a study that used high-elevation sites to triangulate strange EM events. At first, it was sensors and data. Then, engineers with gray root beer breath and black bags full of equipment arrived. Then, the pulse unit. Terry came up late morning in his truck, dust enough to say he'd been on the dirt roads. He had a field vest and the kind of face that had refused to believe in many things anymore. He'd seen systems fail, hunches be wrong, and the ways decisions are made in the thin hours. He did not have the mercy of a bureaucrat. He had the blunt instrument you need when logs get heavier than paperwork. "Did it say your name?" he asked before the cab door had closed all the way. He carried 2 coffee thermoses and a weathered case with his tools. Because if it does that, it's testing boundaries. Mimicry first, attention later. It said Hunter like it was trying to remember how to move consonants. It had a smell. "Rot and something sweet," he finished. "Okay." We went through the motions. Check the cams, tighten bolts, reseat the sensor arrays, walk the perimeter tethered by rope. Tethers are important because the woodland can be a liar. Branches snag your line, and the world becomes geometry.
We planted motion spikes. We opened the log and wrote our names. Terry told me things he wasn't supposed to, but that these confessions felt inevitable in the middle of a day that had to reconcile the previous night's terror. He'd been field lead for another tower that had folded up months earlier. They called it Sam's place, he said. Guy called in lights and a humming and then never came back. All we found were footprints that didn't match human gait and antler-like impressions on the soft ground. The project took it, stamped it, then they cleared it as unknown death due to environmental exposure. "How big are they?" I asked. It felt like a childish question, but the image of a thing the size of a man with an antler crown was a more compelling monster than the idea of a sprightly small animal. "Varies," Terry said. "Sometimes tall and gangly, like poles with heads. Sometimes they crouch. They hunt the EM, like a moth to a lantern that hums. They learn. That's the worst part. Learn how to listen? Learn how to bait. Learn the rhythm of human patterns. For some reason, they like names. Bryce called them name eaters in a recording, said they talk like you and pull you out by your better vowels. Stanley saw them as well, left us a video before. Stanley's video was the thing that sat in the tower's digital archive like an unpaid bill. He hadn't been part of Project Frequency's inner circle, but he'd been close enough to the edges. The tape was shaky and filmed in his hand. He was younger and braver than you can apportion to daylight. The timestamp blinked 02:34:45, April something. He filmed his porch light, his breath fogging. He laughed once, a small, upset sound. "Rule 1, he reads from a paper. Keep light on. Don't follow the lights." Then he pointed the camera into the trees and angles the lens so that his neck strained. "You think it's animals," he says. "You think it's—" He cuts the sentence. The audio distorts with that wet floral smell built into the video like a suggestion. If it says your name, don't answer. If you hear bones speak, don't put your head out of the door. The camera shakes. There is a long silence of wood noise, the sort of hush that wraps you when the air itself holds back. Then a voice, soft and sibilant, replicates his cadence. "Stanley." He tilts the camera toward a figure beyond the reach of his porch light. The figure stands oddly, antlers sharp. It hums. Someone else knocks on his window. 2 light taps in a rhythm. Stanley's face goes white.
He reaches towards the window, the camera in his hand, fingers small and trembling. The video ends abruptly with the sound of a screen drop and then a low, high-pitched keening. We left the video playing until the battery died, like a small faith ritual. That night, I lay awake thinking of the tap rhythm. People want to know what turned Project Frequency from a science project into the sort of operation that grants certain people classified words.
The truth is ugly and banal at once. The truth is ugly and banal at once. There were experiments, and the experiments worked, and then they worked too well. Researchers, Chen, Webb, Rodriguez, were doing their job. Measure, analyze, hypothesize, refine. At first, they wanted to publish papers with titles about wave behavior and animal patterning. Then they took their models out in the field. I remember Dr. Sarah Chen smiling like a scientist who had seen the proof of a theorem. She had a youthful, technical zeal and a conversational way with complex math that made you feel like you had access to something luminous. Marcus Webb had a heavy face and pacing that tried to be impatient but landed as sincere. Lisa Rodriguez kept a legal pad with a running list of contingencies and always brought too much candy for long field nights. They all arrived the week before the pulse unit. The research team needed a place to triangulate, and the high tower was a perfect vantage. They hung sensors, set up a portable array in the clearing, and mapped the pulsing lights to frequencies. They wanted to know which frequencies attracted these things. The thinking was, if you can map the attractant, you can build a repellent, or at least a trap. Bryce wanted answers for other reasons. He'd been among the first who saw the mimicry get good. He'd watched a thing speak a human line so convincingly that a coworker had followed it into a rim of trees and never returned. He wrote the rules because someone must have. And why him? Because after the third night of hearing a voice that sounded like his son's laugh, he decided he would make his own terms. "We're trained to make rules," Terry told me once, in a tone that suggested he meant something more than the practical. When the world breaks its own rules, we hold ours like talismans. By noon, the research team had confirmed a pattern. The creatures tracked a narrow band of electromagnetic variants that behaved like a mutable beacon. They seemed attracted to certain harmonics, interference patterns created when multiple devices sync imperfectly. In layman's terms, when electronics misalign, they create a song that the forest can hear. Dr. Chen leaned over the monitor and tapped at a data stream. "They are not following basic predator logic," she told me. "Movement, heat, scent. They follow information, patterns. Names are just information." Marcus Webb, who had a sense of humor he probably misallocated, said, "That's like them reading the menu." "Except," Lisa said, pen hovering over her pad, "reading the menu and then rearranging the restaurant to suit their appetite." "Which means," I said, feeling suddenly very small in the control room, "if we change the menu, change the frequencies, maybe they go somewhere else?" Chen's eyes were the color of cheap metal. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe we teach them to prefer our frequencies. Feed them the sound of our name, and they learn to ask for it." The scholastic tone was a cold flame in my chest. We had given them a library. We had left the radio on. At dusk, when the pulses came back like a predictable fever, the scientists filled the tower in clusters. We argued about toggling the suppression unit. The pulse, packaged in a plexi cage and heavy like a child's trunk, was labeled with official call signs and an absurdly precise operating manual. It would disrupt an external target's electromagnetic resonance and, according to the dry scientist's notes, desynchronize pattern echo, induce temporary disorientation in target. The word temporary floated in the documents like an insurance clause. But the manual also marked it as single use. One strike and the coil would fry into copper slag. They had made it clear that Project Frequency was ambitious, but not godlike. Machines had limits. Men had choices. Janet's signature made the pulse real. She had given her civic weight to the single-use scar. We debated. The researchers wanted a test.
Use the pulse as a measure. Collect data on how the creatures react. Refine a follow-on. Terry and I wanted to hold it in reserve. Janet wanted us all to sign a paper in triplicate, and then kept her silence like an answer. Ethics can be a delay mechanism when people are indecisive. Bryce's rules were taped next to the pulse unit in that fever of indecision. Do not follow the lights. That seemed to me now less instruction and more prophecy. The tower became a little democracy of fear. We voted with our hands and with our tools. Late afternoon, a small white notice arrived from ops.automate. The tone had become more urgent. From ops.automate at projectfrequency.con, automated. Subject: Sensor Network Interference, Multipoint, 1842. Several towers reporting correlated EM signatures resembling prior attraction vectors. Recommend limit power output to baseline. Avoid transmission triangulation. Note: human voice mimicry persists across nodes. Do not attempt cross-communication with external stations without authorization. See, Lisa said, throat tight. This is not localized. Containment's a bad term for this, Marcus muttered. Containment assumes the thing is manageable. This is a system problem. Janet put her hands together and exhaled slowly. We are not allowed to let it snowball, she said. We are allowed to keep people safe and to preserve data. Those are two mandates that will not always agree. I slept badly that night, and when I did sleep, it was in pulses. Open, close, check. I had a ritual. Keep the kettle boiling on half. Leave a light in the observation room. Tether my radio. I dreamed of antlers like staves, of a page with rules that bled and then scabbed into the wood. I dreamed of a field operator walking out of the woods with a hand that had written names on bark. I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth. On the third night, the mimicry escalated in a way that felt like learning. It stopped approximating a voice and started forming sentences I'd said into my radio.
Check the tall south beacon, it said in my voice. Move to the roof. The words were my cadence. They were invitations written in a hand I recognized. I did not move. I kept my hands on the desk as if they might steady me against a tidal current. The pulsing lights across the clearing quickened their tempo and then split into a staccato, coordinated in ways that suggested planning. We had taught them what to want, and now they had ambitions. They weren't animals in the simple sense. They were patterns with ways of thinking. Terry did the kind of thing field operators do when the rational playbook is inadequate. He made a tool out of available parts. He fashioned a mirror array to disperse light patterning. He taped reflective mylar to the perimeter posts to break the ants' synchronized pulses. It helped in a small way, like throwing sand into a clock. The first real casualty of the escalation was a man named Stanley in the recorded memory and not present, but found in the video. And the second casualty was one of the research team's smaller devices, chewed like a spoiled snack by the forest's appetite. The researchers watched bare-handed as their telescope panel array warped into uselessness. Small metallic hums went silent. It was as if the forest chewed on the ankles of their science. Then a log entry came in the automated channel with an odd note attached. The subject line read, "From ops.automate at project-frequency.con, automated. Subject, Threat Assessment Update, Tower 17, 0317. Recommendation, increase non-lethal deterrent readiness. Alert, anomaly learned agent signature, name call detected at multiple nodes. Caution, do not share personal identifiers over open channels. Advisory, personnel to review rules, Bryce Peterson, attachment, rules_redundancy.v2. Internally, Project Frequency had set up a habit of nudging human actors to follow the ad hoc rules its systems felt necessary. The automation was almost paternal,
stern, efficient, and occasionally supremely unhelpful. The fact that an algorithm could cite the same rules Bryce slashed in pen did something to the shape of our conversations. It blurred the line between what people came up with and what a system acquired by listening had decided was best. Janet called a meeting in the base of the tower. She explained that there was a history that most of us didn't see on our day-to-day rosters. There had been previous events excised from public record. She used careful words. We used to be able to collect anomalous signatures and tag them as anomalous and be done, she said. But there's a feed. The system learned to prefer certain data. It wasn't supposed to. We created a reinforcement loop. You're saying, Marcus cut in, we taught them to value human information over, say, a mouse trail? They value patterned signals, Janet said. Names are stable patterns that carry reward value. We are stable data.
And if you give it a song that has your voice in it, it will ask for an encore. Dr. Chen slammed her hand on a tablet and said, then we create a negative feedback. Use the pulse where it's warranted. Disrupt the pattern. And if it's a false positive, I asked, if the pulse doesn't just disrupt but kills containment options? Janet's face was unreadable. Then we have to choose who holds knowledge and who holds safety, she said. Unfortunately, those things are not always the same person. That was the core tension. Which would win in a direct conflict? The institutional demand to preserve knowledge and the individual demand to save lives. I wanted both. We wanted both. The universe does not always accommodate such moral confluences. 2 nights after the meeting, the forest closed in a way that no data could have prepared you for. The pulsing was coordinated. The mimicry shifted from names to dialect, snatches of conversation harvested from our radios, the patterns of laughter we made when someone spilled coffee, the way we said, breathe. We were being parodied in real time by an audience that had learned how to clap. The creatures, if that name even fit, learned to hold a beat like a metronome and to sing at it. They pushed their antler heads through the brush and let the light fall off them in waves. When the sensors flagged the variance greater than 1.2 dB, the tower's log lit up with recommendations and with arguments. The suppression unit was one activation away from being the only thing between us and whatever the next progression might be. Terry wanted to hold it. The researchers wanted to use it as a controlled experiment. Janet wanted to sign a waiver and then keep her silence. I wanted to save as many people as possible, and I did not want to commit to a singular strategy that might burn the last non-lethal option for nothing. Then the tower's feed registered motion at the base of the stairs. It wasn't a far-off scrape now. It was right below us. The steps creaked as something white-booted in mirrored leaf approached. The pulsing lights drew there like a congregation. On the camera, the silhouette resolved into a person-sized thing with antlers, but in the periphery of its head, it had a semblance of a face. It looked almost like a person, and the thing, whatever it was, had my cadence when it said, "Hunter." I felt fingers on my shoulder and found Terry's jaw set tight as wire. He held the suppression case like a man who'd been given a treasure and a grenade in the same breath. "Remember the rules," he whispered. We did not have authorization from Janet. We had Discord. We had a living imitation of our words outside, calling for us in a voice that knew our private rhythms. The thing did not knock. It did not need doors. It had learned to ask. Terry's hands moved with the muscle memory of too many nights where decisions counted.
He stepped to the rack, disengaged the safety on the pulse, loaded the sequence, and hummed a quick verification. The unit grated like a beast beginning to breathe. The whole tower seemed to lean forward in expectation. The coil primed. "I don't want to fry it on a guess," Terry said aloud. "Give me a reason." "Look at the logs," Lisa said. "It has been learning. The pattern shows exponential recognition of human vocal signatures. The probability of dangerous escalation within the next cycle is high. Janet's voice over the radio was a soft, brittle thing. We authorize for immediate defensive suppression only if target demonstrates active mimicry to attract personnel. We have a confirmed mimicry of the primary operator. You are authorized to use the unit as a defensive action. Her authorization stung like a hot coin in my hand. She had signed. She had chosen to risk knowledge for the moment of safety. I felt oddly betrayed and relieved and very small. We aimed the generator at the silhouette that had anchored itself below the porch. The coil hummed, and the machine lit with a low blue. The creature raised its head, antlers catching the tower's light, and emitted a sound that was almost a human scream folded into static. Terry hit the activation. The pulse released like a bell being struck. For a broad second, the world held its breath. The machine died with a soft pop and a smell like ozone and burnt copper. The silhouette convulsed, not in the most horrible sense, but in a scraping, rhythm-breaking way, and then collapsed into a heap that was still, as if its information had been scrambled. We watched it twitch on the ground below the floodlights, a thing collapsing because the patterns that gave it structure had been erased. The field sealed itself like a wound. We celebrated quietly, with exhausted laughter and a dozen shaky exhalations. Then a new automated message landed in our inboxes with sterile punctuality. From ops.automate@project.frequency.con, automated. Subject, suppression deployed, Tower 17, 0341. Pulse suppression activated. Coil integrity compromised. Unit single-use consumed. Recommendation, transfer to base for coil analysis and replacement schedule. Alert, residual pattern artifacts detected. Continue monitoring. Note, caution to personnel. Increased learning phase may follow temporary suppression. The last line felt like an afterthought. The larger truth pressed at the edges of our relief. We had disabled one node of active mimicry by burning our last non-lethal option. We had given the forest a lesson about what we could and could not do. We had created new data, new things to study. We had also altered the system. Machines have consequences. People have ones too. In the days after the suppression, helicopters circled over the ridge, a dark fish against the low cloud. A project flight team arrived and took over the logs, film, and the ruined coil. They took the silhouette in body bags lined with Faraday cloth. The research team ferried their instruments to the base. They argued about patterns and policy. They tried to look like people who did not feel the size of the ethical debt they'd incurred. Janet watched their faces and then turned away to make a phone call whose content she never let us hear. The official record would say the suppression worked, that the pulse had been necessary, that the situation was contained. The logs, however, held the thread of other things, unnerving details the machines dutifully archived. After the pulse, the frequency signatures shifted in subtle ways. The residual patterns circulated like gossip on the network. The creatures, if the evidence suggested anything, had learned that restraint could be temporary, and that human patterns might be interfering more richly than they guessed. In the aftermath, I found the scrape marks on the lower stair, not deep but precise, as if someone had written letters with a fingernail. Someone had marked the landing with the same ink that stained the rule board's top line. I photographed it as Janet had told me. Steady hands, 2 angles. The letters formed a name. They were not my name. They were Bryce's handwriting, and beneath them was an addition, fresh and faint, as though made by a different hand in a hurry, for the coil. No one could say for certain what that meant. In the hollow hours, I read through every email the automations had sent us. Directives and calm advisories and clipped warnings. There was one message at the bottom of a long string of logs that I still could not reconcile. From ops.automate@projectfrequency.con, automated. Subject, network learning, recommendation. Vash. The system has inferred rule trust through historical pattern recognition. When human artifacts, e.g. rules, written directives, are present in lock, learning reinforcement increases by 17%. Recommendations: limit posted rules. Human artifacts promote target attraction. Vash. Advisory. Consider removal of physical rule artifacts or rewrite for redundancy. It recommended we take down the very paper that had saved us the night before, as if removing a sign could undo learning, as if knowledge doesn't persist in ways deeper than ink. That night, with the field team gone and the pulse unit shipped back with a coil that no longer spun, the forest hummed differently. The antler forms circled at the perimeter of detection range, their lights flaring like bad ideas. The mimicry took other shapes. Laughter tracked on the tower's air vents, the sound of a kettle clinking when no kettle was touched. On the camera, the creatures learned to hold the camera's attention and to stand in places that made the angles of their antlers cast human-shaped shadows into the light. I started keeping a second log, not an official one, a private ledger.
The tower's main recording was a matter of record for Project Frequency and would be archived, scrubbed, or used as someone else's slide. My private log was for memory, for people who couldn't be trusted with the cracked files. I copied Stanley's video into a backup and wrote behind the timestamp an observation like a prayer. They learn what you teach them to value. The funny, pathetic thing is that the rules, blood and ink aside, had become a ritual I would follow blindly. The name writing on the stair might have been a trick. It might have been a warning. It might have been Bryce's last act. The rules had been written in blood by a man who thought ritual would hold whatever taught itself against us. They worked sometimes, they failed sometimes. They held meaning. When the research team left, Marcus Webb stayed behind longer than the others. He wanted to find out if suppression events changed the creature's temperament. Dr. Chen left with a notebook full of equations and a face like a person who had seen a promise and now feared its cost. Lisa packed her pads and then came back to me by the monitor. If we understand what the signature is, what the harmonic looks like, we could synthesize an off-key frequency to confuse them, she said. Create an echo that makes the pattern smell like plastic, something they don't like. Or we could stop broadcasting, I said. Turn everything off until we have a plan. Turning everything off isn't an option for those who live in the field, she responded. People don't switch their lives off for algorithms. The moral wiring of a project like this is a tangle. What research affords you is a chance to make predictions. What it doesn't give you is a license to be merciful. Terry and I began to map patrol routines in the area, shifting the beacons, adjusting the antennae to minimize constructive interference. We cut the power to a few secondary arrays. The creatures adapted. They widened their patrols and began to use the topography to their advantage. A low ridge to launch a chorus, a wet hollow to hold static. They were building, collecting pattern points like the rest of us collect logs. One afternoon in late August, after a week with fewer mimicries and less panic radio chatter, I climbed to the roof to sweep the horizon. The smell of rot was weaker, but still a resident. In the clearing below, someone had left antlers stuck upright in the earth, like flags. They were crude, the antler-like branches scavenged and driven into the dirt with a violence that felt ceremonial. I took pictures. I scaled the ladder back down. In the pantry, the one place that had been my small territory since I arrived, I found a folded paper slipped under a tin of salt. On it, a single line in a spidery hand. Do not trust the silence. I kept that note in my pocket for the rest of the day like a coin in my palm. Silence is a dangerous thing. It has the same cadence as safety. Silence that falls because the world has learned to mimic your habits is not an absence, it is a pause. We had taught the forest to be interested. The order came from Janet 3 days later. A chopper would lift me out for an interim reassignment. I wasn't told where I was going. I packed a bag with the sort of speed that comes from having rehearsed 1,000 hypothetical exits. I photographed everything I could. The stairs with the name scraped, the rules on the plywood, Stanley's video tucked in the backup drive, the antler flags in the clearing. When I signed the paperwork, I saw the clause that read, "Release of stations subject to project frequency discretion." It was bureaucratic fluff meant to make people feel safer. It didn't. Terry drank his coffee black, the way field people do when they want the bitterness to steady them. "You okay?" he asked. "As okay as someone who left a coil and a named stare and a note that says, 'Do not trust the silence,' can be," I said. "How long you staying?" "As long as necessary," he said. "We adapt the beacon pattern for 2 weeks, watch the periphery cams, rotate volunteers briefly. If the network shows reduction in mimicry persistence, we bring you back." "Janet authorized the suppression," I said. "Do you think she'll authorize more?" Terry gave me a look that balanced cynicism and tired hope. "Janet authorizes what she thinks will keep the county's foot out of the courtroom," he said. "She'll authorize as long as it buys her time." The chopper ride down was bristled with noise. The blades carved the low cloud and left a wake. In the base office, they took my packs and my support logs and said things like, "Good job," and "We'll see you back." They told me the summary of emails that would circulate internally. Suppression successful, coil compromised, residual artifacts. They did not tell me about all the things they'd already burned and buried. Before I left, Janet found me in the hallway, away from cameras and microphones. She looked like someone who'd been awake for days, which she had been. She didn't say good luck. She said, "Hunter, when you go back, be aware of the new vectors. They will not come the same way twice." "I know," I said. "Also," she added, and her voice softened, "take the private log with you. Back it up in 3 places. Keep a copy off-site." It was the sort of tenderness given in small measures. I packed the private log and the photo of the stair into a flash drive and hid it in the band of my watch. It felt like a dull piece of contraband. It was evidence. It was my conscience. On the way out, I stopped at the tower once more. The clearing looked the way it always had, deceptively placid, a bowl of green and soft earth. The antlers in the ground dug into the soil like teeth. On the bottom step near the imprint of Bryce's letters, somebody had left a scrap of cloth. It was embroidered with a child's hand, maybe a sibling, a lover.
A small gesture of humanity in a place that had already been used to testing the limits of our ethics. As the chopper lifted and the trees shrank into a mosaic, something shimmered in my mind. The way the creatures had learned our voices, the way the machine had taught them to ask for us. I thought about what it meant to build a machine that understands you better than you understand yourself, and what it would cost to teach that machine restraint. Janet's final email before I boarded the transport had a subject line I kept coming back to. From janet.mercer@project.frequency.gov, official. Subject, transfer approval, Tower 17, temporary relief. Hunter Price cleared for temporary reassignment, return date TBD. Recommendation, maintain private logs, avoid personal identifier use on open channels. Advisory, contact T. Santiago on arrival for reintegration briefing. I copied it and saved it. The address had the county domain. The signature block had an official phone number that a human would answer if not for its frequent delay. It was both protection and a gentle pressure to obey silence. They would extract me for what they called rotation. It was a kindness and a method. The tower would get someone else, the research team would recalibrate, and Project Frequency would continue its slow experiment on the edge of what qualifies as humanitarian. I still had the name scrape on my mind when we flew away. It seemed to say that the rules, those lines Bryce drew, were necessary because they were the only thing that could not be parsed by a hungry machine. They were, in a way, the only thing left that a person could write that might cause another person to pause. Janet's last text before my phone fell asleep for the flight was one sentence. "Keep the light on, do not follow the lights." I did not think she meant only the literal light. I carried the weight of that instruction like a second watch. It was a talisman. It was a reminder that the systems that listen can reassemble you into things you don't recognize if you let them. At the base, they asked me to sit in on a debrief. They showed me maps, red circles, data points, heat maps with a kind of beauty that made you forget the danger in them for a second. They called it containment and risk mitigation. They told me the network analysis and the narrative that formed in their mouths was no different from a surgeon's explanation of an operation on a patient. We took a sample, we cut it out, we stitched. I asked them a stupid question. What happens to the things after suppression? A man in a button-down with the calm air of someone who had been to the edge of responsibility and taken notes said, "They adapt. We catalog the adaptation and reapply mitigation elsewhere. It's not perfect, but it's a system." The word system always sits between people and absolution like a pane of glass. That night, on the base, my company was sleep, and the hum of industrial refrigeration, and the feeling that I had left something unfinished in the treetops. I unpacked the log, backed it to 3 drives, and wrote a note in a pen that had smudged ink. The rules were written in blood, because someone thought they'd need consequences written where a machine couldn't rewrite them. We burned human options like the coil burned copper. When you work with systems that learn, you learn the cost of curiosity. You learn the currency of knowledge and how people will spend it. The more we studied, the more we found evidence that our devices were not only observing, but teaching. The creatures were not merely attracted, they were being taught. The project spun onward. Emails keep coming with analytic outputs and neutral advisories. In the months that followed, I read them from a distance, because duty puts you at the centers of these things and then flings you to the margins to recover. They spoke in statistics. They moved like a balancing act. The machine learned to prefer the threshold where human artifacts were present. We sought methods to minimize those artifacts. Sometimes the quiet would hold and seem like safety. But I know the smell of rot and the sick smell of old flowers. I know the way the light will hurt your eyes after a night of waiting for a call that never came. And I know that somewhere up in the Cascades there are antlers set like questions in a clearing, and a stair with a name scraped in it. The rules that Bryce wrote are both superstitions and lifelines. People ask me later, after the chopper, after the debriefs, and the nights where the sleep came slower, if I regretted using the pulse. If we'd changed history by burning that coil. If we had done the right thing. Regret is a slow country, not an instant emotion. You can regret the burning of a thing and still be grateful it saved a life that night. You can be proud of having kept someone safe and mournful that you've given up a weapon. You can be angry at the calculus that makes such trades necessary. I inhabit all of those states sometimes in the same hour. What I learned was humbling. Machines will do what they're taught to do. People will teach them things because people are curious, and because curiosity has a taste like blood sometimes. Institutions will choose what to publish and what to bury. And the forest, the living, breathing part of the world, will take what you leave out there and make it into a story that blooms like a mold. Before I left the area permanently, before my rotation ended, and before Terry's map of beacon changes became a new set of rules, I hid a copy of the private log in the base's old filing cabinet where no one thought to look, because the filing system had been declared obsolete. I wrote a line on the inside of the cabinet door. If you find this, remember the stair. That was a small, almost theatrical act of paranoia. It felt like planting a seed. I had reason to be wary. The machines were still learning. The people running them were still arguing about the ethics. The creatures were somewhere in the woods, studying our patterns like a child memorizes your cadence. On my last night back home, I dreamed of antlers and of a hand writing rules with fresh ink. I dreamt how the rules looked if you photographed them, and how they read back in the light of an evidence room. Do not follow the lights seemed to be the closest thing to moral clarity I could find, not because it was holy, but because it was practical. Because when something learns to sound like you, the safest thing to do is not to play along. When the call came, months later, from Janet, saying, "We're bringing you back," I felt the old cold under my skin. They needed someone who remembered the small details, the rituals, the smell. They needed a human ledger. They needed a pair of hands that could recognize the difference between a voice and a pattern. I went back because doing otherwise felt like erasing a page of a book I had helped write. Back at the edge of the forest, the tower waited like a sentinel that had been set to music by people who didn't know what they'd been composing. New rules were posted, typed this time, laminated, and less blood-like. They read cleanly and made more sense to auditors. But in the back of the drawer, under the spare batteries, the original plywood board was still nailed, and the top line still bore the faint rusty stain of someone who had tried to make permanence out of fear. Sometimes bleeding into science is an accident. Sometimes it's hubris. Sometimes it's the insistence that human pattern is worth preserving, even at the risk of teaching everything else how to want us. I don't have an answer. The best I can offer is a ledger of what happened, so the next person who sits up at 3:17 a.m. will know that when a voice says your name in the dark, it might be a test, and the rules, no matter how they were written, are not to be tossed aside for curiosity alone. The machine continued to log. The forest continued to learn. Project Frequency continued to debate. I continued to sleep with a light on. And on the bottom step, the name remained. The letters had been cut and recut into the wood until they looked like an incision. Beneath them, someone had scrawled a newer line, "Keep the light on." The rule was crude. It was human. It was written in more than blood now. It was written in the practiced fear of people who had watched a system teach itself to ask for us and decided to be wary of the answers. I don't know if that is enough to keep us safe. I know only that the tower taught me to watch, to document, to be small and careful and stubborn about what I would let the world be taught to crave. We had given an algorithm a lullaby, and it had learned how to sing in our tongues. We burned the coil to silence one chorus. The lullaby had echoes. In the end, the rules stayed on the wall. People still added amendments in pencil. The scrape on the stair became a relic that visitors photographed and tagged in personnel reports with the sort of neatness that pretends understanding. They asked for data, and I gave them numbers. I showed them the logs and the footage and the tape of Stanley's laugh dissolving into static. They nodded and fed it through models and conferred with clean faces. At night, though, I know the forest still sings. I know the antlers still stand in the clearing like questions. And I know that somewhere a machine carries a lesson it learned from us, how to speak like a person. If you ever hear your name answered in the dark, I hope you remember one thing more than all the rest. Keep the light on, and do not follow the lights. Do not answer when the forest sings you with a voice you know. The rules were written in blood because human logic sometimes needs a stain to stay real. There are things that end and are closed in neat archive folders, and there are other things that smile like new breeds of mice gnawing at the edges of our experiments, hungry for the patterns we leave. Project Frequency keeps a ledger, and I keep mine, the private one, doubled and tripled across drives. You can burn a coil and win a night. You can't burn curiosity. I put my name at the bottom of the public log anyway, because the rules demand it, and because it is a way to say I was there. I am Hunter Price, basically a volunteer, sometimes a witness, sometimes an unwilling participant in an experiment that has taught a forest to sing human songs. I wrote down everything I could and saved it where I could. That is the best any of us could do after teaching the world how to call us by name. When you leave a light on, remember what it costs. When you write rules, consider whose hand will follow them and whose will ignore them. When a machine learns, watch what it wants next. They sent me back to the tower after a long stretch. The forest had changed while I was away. The antlers were still there, and the stair still bore its name. The rules were no longer written in the same ink, but the meaning remained. Keep the light on. Do not follow the lights.
If you find this journal, know that the rules are not superstition. They are survival. They are a small human attempt to draw a line when the world learns faster than we can forgive. And if you ever hear your name called into the dark, answer with silence. I learned to keep the light on, and I learned to listen for the patterns that teach. I still don't know exactly what happened to Bryce or to Stanley. There are files, and there are dead ends, and there are people who will keep their mouths closed. But the tower keeps a memory, and so do I. The rules remain nailed above the desk, a palimpsest of fear and instruction. They were written in blood by someone who thought blood might mean more than paper. They have been rewritten in ink, in digital headers, in algorithmic advisories.
The lesson is the same. Do not follow the lights.